So I'm trying to build Madison Wall into a going concern that is much bigger than me. And certainly the infrastructure that I'm trying to put in place is trying to make a number of things more systemic. A lot of the elements that we baked into Madison Wall are ideas that are replicable. There's a process, and there's a lot of value to be created. And if we can do more of it and at a bigger scale, that's probably the simplest way to characterize it. At a practical level, I need to free up my time because there's too much activity,
Yeah.
right? And also not only is there a lot of demand from a consulting and advisory perspective, but there's so much that's not that we haven't had capacity to do. So broadening out some of the data products that will cover things like going deeper and broader into ad tech, deeper and broader into other countries, um, requires more manpower or person power, human power. Um, and so the combination of those things means, we just keep expanding. We invest, um, you know, what thankfully is a healthy business into growth. And yeah, it's just onward and upward, literally.
Yeah, I think, to reiterate some of what Brian said, like building more data sets, faster answers to client questions, augmenting Brian's existing huge knowledge base with some of my expertise around a lot of the really fast growing areas of the ad economy, whether that's programmatic advertising or search or social or retail media. So just trying to make sure that one, Madison and Wall is still the go-to place, the leading voice for clients trying to figure out what's happening in the ad economy. And two, that when they have questions, we can reliably get them prompt answers, and really be their first line of defense for figuring out what they want to do with their business.
Well, I want to come back to Luke in particular joining, but I just want to go back to the nut question, which is, can you, it's been a couple of years since you launched Madison and Wall. It's a great product. We value it very highly as journalists, and we cover you when it's relevant and appropriate. But I do think some of our readers probably don't really understand the mission and what the product is. So can you just step back and explain, like, your part publisher, your part media economist, your part analyst, your part consultants? In your own words, define what the
Yeah.
product is and where you want to take it next.
Well, it's an integrated consulting advisory firm and data firm, essentially. And that means that, and we use Substack as a publishing platform at the present time. And so people use the term content, that's fine. I don't think of it that way, but yeah, it is technically. But the idea is that we provide integrated consulting advisory service that ties our data to the work we do. So we provide advisory services to senior executives. I mean, our target customer is a CEO, a CFO, a chief strategy officer, a chief revenue officer from any business that depends in any way on advertising. And go back to when I started doing this, I realized within a few months that if I'm going to actually provide these services, which is where I thought, frankly, even when I joined Group M, this was the sort of work that I was most interested in doing. But to be able to do that work, I needed to have the data at my disposal that I trusted. And it's not that I didn't trust the insights of my successors at the places I had previously worked, but it's not the same level of depth of knowledge if you don't have, for lack of a better word, ownership of that data. And so what I realized then after I started rebuilding from scratch industry level data, was that I realized that a proposition that many of the world's most successful consulting firms have is that they rely heavily on third parties, including us, for data, and then they provide advisory services around that data. Now, often, and not to get cynical, but often those consulting engagements are focused on giving their client's answers that the client already knows the answer to. And then they're just looking for data to support it. And that's fine. That's an important, that serves an important function too. And we'll definitely provide our data to anyone who needs it for that purpose. But the kind of work that we want to do is where ideally the client doesn't know the answer to the question. And take something like connected TV, which I know you've written about with our coverage. If one were to just take if one were providing a consulting engagement about whether and how they should invest in connected TV assets or ad tech or strategies, whatever, the consultant will almost certainly look to a third party that shows growth in connected TV because the clients decided they're going to invest in that space. And now you need to show the data or show some data from a credible third party to help validate the choice one way or another. Now, there's a certain bias that follows from that. You're going to look for growthy data or the best, most positive spin on the data just to provide your services. At the end of the day, the consultant is providing value-added insights on how to compete, on how to take share, because no one has 100% of a market typically. And so it doesn't matter in some ways what the data is, given the nature of those engagements. But what we want to do in terms of the consulting work that we're doing is we want to be able to provide advice about, well, the industry's not growing 14%, it's more like 4%. That's going to lead to very different strategies. We think it's growing by, say, a 4% number because we dug into the data like this. We have confidence in the data like that. And it leads to different conclusions about what your strategy might be. And it's just a very different approach. But because we have ownership of the data, ownership in terms of the development process of the data, it just gives us a richer insight in terms of the strategic advice that we give and a different kind of engagement. I'd add, we also aren't going to be in the business of, at this time at least, having an army of, consultants to produce massive volumes of presentation decks and massive volumes of stakeholder engagements for the sake of developing those decks. That's not the kind of work we're doing. We're dealing much more with the principals, again, CEO, CFO, CRO, CSO, more directly, and in collaboration sometimes with the third-party consultants that they're engaging. But having that underlying data is core to it. So this is a very long-winded answer to your question, but we can't provide that consulting advisor service without the data. Now, having produced the data and, again, this ongoing narrative of our understanding of the industry that helps us be better at providing that consulting advisor service, there are a lot of clients who don't want us for the consulting and advisory capability, but they really do want to consume this information to do with it what they will, whether that just informs their questions with their advisors or their teams or stakeholders, whatever. And that's fine too. And so we can arm those clients with our product. So that's the vision of Madison Wall.
Yeah, so certainly I've covered your history and Luke's history. I covered Bob Cohen for nearly 2 decades before you came along. And one of the things I admired about your approach was the intellectual way you approached it, because he was in a very rudimentary time. And we had this top down, he canvassed the worldwide McCann network or Interpublic network, and you rebooted it. You did this very arduous grounds up approach, bringing in lots of third party data like, well, government data like IRS or whatever, to help build your ground truth. And I think that's what's made a better product. I think the whole industry has moved more in that direction. It's hard work, and I understand why you need someone like Luke. Both you and Luke have a similar background. You come out of a securities analyst background. I think both of you have now been in the ad industry more than you were in Wall Street, even though you still call yourselves Madison and Wall. But I think it's changed and given discipline to something that me as a journalist who covers the economy of media really value. And I think you're the closest thing to gospel truth. What I'm trying to understand is how the industry has changed around this. Because when you started out, Publicis slash Zenith Optomedia was the bi-party along Magna. And then Group M made a big push, obviously. I think surpassed them in whatever media economy, brand equity there is in the world. Um, I think Publicis NF Media is kind of sunset from what I can see. I don't think they even a factor anymore. Group M now slash WPP Media is really kind of, in my opinion, a shadow of what they were before. I think Magna's still strong. I think it's held its core, but I think what I'm seeing is that those guys are being more marginalized in terms of being a ground truth. And I think there's a real opportunity now for you, because you have that history, both of you, to build on that. I'm just curious what your take is on what the most important, I mean, it's a loaded question, on what the best source for
Well,
economy is.
yeah, well, I mean, a couple things. By the way, to add to what we were saying earlier, and this is actually really important, on your comment on Wall Street versus Madison Avenue. Both Luke and I are CFA charter holders, and actually every full-time employee of Madison Wall is either a CFA charter holder or in the program. That's really important. We're not, because we're not
Yeah.
industry analysts first, we're financial analysts first.
You can actually advise me on stock positions.
Well, that's not all CFA. That's not necessarily, but that's an important distinction of the brand. And back keeping the Wall Street piece of it, we are CFA charter holders, which has all sorts of ethical obligations, has all sorts of um, technical skills baked in. So I would just flag that as a thing. First of all, I'd say that, and again, I think Luke can obviously understands where Magna is better than I do at this point in time. And I would say that Group M and WPP Media, I think, has done fantastic work. In both cases, what they've done, and I think they have fantastic people there, their primary client is the marketer. It's not that there's not external clients that they work with. Of course they do, and the media owners who value what they do. Of course they do. And I think that when it comes to global data, I mean, we haven't built out our capabilities yet beyond Canada.
Right.
We'll add other countries as we go. And I think the processes that those two entities use are as good as it gets. So I still,
Tap in the worldwide network, insights and intelligence.
but let's clarify. It's not in all of these cases, private information gives you very little advantage. Public information is, in general, I'll argue, superior. And I think that sometimes inside of the worldwide networks, there's too much confidence. And I think that I'm sure Luke could talk to this. I know my experience had both places. Constantly, you'd go to the individual country leaders who should be, or the seemingly most knowledgeable people in the countries about the health of their ad markets. And we could consistently prove them wrong using public data, which is more of a statement of, again, how important good financial analysis is. So let's first of all start with that. To your point on like where the best truth is of data on the ad market, I think it's the process. And so when you look at the historical basis of the data, the process that each of the three entities, whether it's Magna or whether it's WPP Media or us, go through is very similar. But what's different is how we go to market, how we productize it, how we, as far as I know, no one else with this truth of data is providing ongoing analysis, and is primarily focused on helping sellers of advertising and services and software in the way that we are. I mean, Luke, I don't know, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think also, Joe, like in order to get at that truth, there are so many clues out there in the industry. I mean, there's financial statements, there's syndicated data sources, there's 1,000 different clues. And at Madison and Wall, we combine that financial rigor. So both Brian and my background in financial analysis and economics and statistics with that industry knowledge with about how brands make strategic decisions, what some of the quirks about methods or platforms or transactions, all of that industry knowledge that comes together to really define where money's going and which of these intelligence mosaic data points are going to point us towards that truth. So I think that combination is really unique and not found outside of Madison and Wall.
So over the last decade, I've really thought a lot about the concept of information asymmetry, which applies in a lot of different ways, but increasingly has been used in the ad business. And I think industries and markets don't like symmetry. They like when numbers agree and that there's a common denominator. And I think remarkably, the general ad forecasts have been aligned, across the major ones. But I think there's still a need for saying something is ground truth in this area. And you mentioned CTV earlier. And the reason I picked up on your CTV analysis is I think there's a real problem with what that is definitionally. What is OTT? What is streaming? What is CTV? And that the industry doesn't even have a standard common definition of that. So I'd like there to be this authoritative source as a journalist that I could go to and say, whether it's Madison Wall or Nielsen or the IAB or whatever it is. And I don't think we have that right now, but I'm rooting for you guys. And this is kind of a loaded question, but I thought about your time at Group M when you and Kate Scott Dawkins would do the podcast, which I thought was great because it was the only time in the industry I saw the deliberation process, how you guys actually think, what the workflow was, when you would talk about line items and how you built things up and redefine them. The insight when you explained that YouTube is the biggest music platform in the world was fascinating to me. Um, I think there's a need for that. I would like you guys to seriously consider doing a regular podcast. And by the way, Media Post would be happy to host it or at least redistribute it or link to it, because I think it would be a great industry service. I think it would be a good promotion for your
Stay tuned for
company.
that. Well, we do have the Madison Wall podcast is weekly right now. So yeah, you'll surely be hearing from Luke on that.
But I like that deliberation process.
Yeah.
I just think that was important and it's missing now.
I
Oh,
think also,
thank you. Go
no,
ahead.
I was just going to say, Joe, like to your point, the industry is just getting more fragmented and more complex and changing faster and faster. So, uh, Brian and I collaborating to have the flexibility to focus on some of those new topics and questions that maybe didn't exist even a year ago or 2 years ago. And leveraging my history of talking to hundreds of brands and every publisher across the industry and really understand how they're making decisions, I think is going to help us answer some of those questions that maybe don't have an easy, unified source or clear consensus in the industry and really chip away at getting to some of that truth that maybe has eroded over the past decade.
Yeah. One other thing, actually, yeah, it's a really good point. And I think the deliberations are so important because maybe there in many cases there isn't a ground truth for
Mhm.
there's no one truth in the sense that 50 years ago or when Bob Cohn started doing his work 70 years ago, um, there was one way to buy a television and a narrow group of marketers who bought it. And I mean, in many ways, there's more homogeneity on a lot of dimensions of the economy and society and all that relative to where the world is. And because the world is so fragmented on many levels, many dimensions, but not least of which is how marketers manage media plans, um, and how sellers sell advertising. Um, it is important to hear the deliberations of definitions
Yeah.
and the subjectivity and the qualitative elements. Because yeah, like I've always said that, like again, whether it's CTV and do you include YouTube or not include YouTube in your definition? So then the beholder. We can argue where it's going to go, and we can argue what it is today, and you can build a model around either approach. And not wrong, they're just different.
Yeah, but I would argue even in the old days, there were those spectrums of views of what a medium was. I mean, TV was a performance medium back in the day. There was this thing called DRTV and stuff
Yeah.
like that. But all did get homogenized because it was simpler times. But you take something like retail media today, there's probably a $50 billion range depending on whose definition you take on what that market actually is.
Well, the focus has to be on making sure that the definitions are clear and understood. And again, I think that it comes down to, like, certainly for us, there'll be a clear, and this is also where Luke is going to be incredibly valuable because he'll be able to help me refine some of these definitions where I've got ideas about how to define them, but they'll be made better by having another voice who's done this, frankly, longer than I have. That's another thing to keep in mind. Remember, my time at, if you added up all my time at IPG and WPP, I think Luke actually has more time on than I do on that front.
I think it
Uh,
was 12 years in Magna, right?
13, yeah.
13,
Yeah.
okay.
And I was
Uh,
only 8 years, just under, I was 7.5 years at Magna and 4 years at Group M. So
Collectively, you're over a quarter century of intelligence.
sure. But I'm saying Luke has actually gone through this process and these cycles more than I did.
but I
Um,
think it's valuable certainly to be clear and transparent about, as Madison and Wall, how do we add up all these numbers, but also to have the granularity and the flexibility in our data where if we're working with a client who says, hey, I want to assemble these in a different way, that we're just reallocating things within our model and can adapt to whatever anyone's definition of those numbers is.
So I want to ask you a question about the trade press role and media post in particular, because I kind of feel like you and I have done a lot of deliberation over the years. A lot of back channel stuff that maybe was never public, where you told me why something I do is stupid, but I still do it.
Didn't say it
Like,
that way, but go on.
well, like doing gross versus net on, political
Well,
things
not
like.
stupid, but
All right.
there are I'd flag alternative approaches.
When you were defining what social media was back in Magna days, you took me on a 1 day social sojourn trip across New York to talk to different parties before. Those were privileged access, and I really appreciate them. But they also helped inform me as a journalist to think differently about what the economy of this industry is. And right now, you don't agree in the way I use guidelines data, for example. I think you think it's a disproportionate subset of the market. But my view is we don't have the access to the data you do. I mean, we're journalists, we're relying on sources to provide us access. And my vision is more like Dow Jones, which is they didn't publish one market index, they published the Dow Jones Industrial Average, but they publish other like Standard and Poor's or whatever, because there is no pure view of Wall Street trading. I don't think there's a pure view of Madison Avenue trading, and I'd just like to hear your opinion about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to interpret different data differently and understand what it means. Um, Again, I think, take guideline. I think that the data it doesn't claim to represent the whole market. I think whenever it's been a few years or a couple of years, I think, since we talked about it. Um, but there's going to be times where they produce data that is different than the whole market. And I think my only pushback to you in context of maybe something I produced that was contrary to what maybe they said was that we at Madison Wall typically are not claiming to say, here's what the agency world is doing, or here's what this set of marketers doing, or we'll call it out if that's what it is. The issue is always in the nuance of like, well, our data, when we publish a forecast, we are claiming to represent the whole market, or say the whole industry is doing this based on our assumption. In the case of guideline, it's making a different claim, right? They're saying that their data says the following. And so then the only caution I've ever recommended to you is those qualifiers. Or I mean, take such a great example where this morning I was writing something about for one of our the agency business newsletter. I was referencing what's gone on with Stagwell in Israel, and I initially wrote. I think I started writing. I used the word Stagwell cancels or ends um, relationship with Israel, and then I reread carefully the statement they gave Politico. And it's like technically that like the choice of words is important. It wasn't cancels, but they ended their arrangement. Like subtle but different because I realized parsing the words, they're probably going to do more work in the future.
Right.
But I mean, the point is, and on contentious things, that is obviously more contentious than a lot of things that we might do. But then the choice of word matters because it does convey something very different.
Look, as a news editor, I think those stories are very important because they have economic consequence. Whenever there's disruption, money is made and lost somewhere. I like the piece you did initially on Charlie Kirk and Jimmy Kimmel, but I think you could have gone deeper about what the explicit economic fallout was from that. Or whether it's Stagwell in Israel. Personally, I just think you're the authority, and I'm not. I'm just a journalist covering this, and I'd like to hear more authoritative views
Yeah.
on.
Well, I think also, Joe, one of the things that excites me so much about moving to Madison and Wall is because we're independent and small, we can have those fast and direct conversations. We can be candid about reacting to what's happening in real time. And, we can have those direct discussions with clients, with the market, with journalists, open-ended conversations, and really share our idea across and figure out together, like, what is the viewpoint that we're going publicly out with.
Yeah, we won't shy away from something like take the Kimmel News. We won't shy away from writing about it. The question I always have is what value are we adding? And are we, for lack of a better word, within our lane? I mean, and you can see political points of view, but if we can't connect it to the things that our clients are paying us for, we're not going to do it. And so in the case of Kimmel, I mean, I wrote the consequences are hard to tangibly articulate. They're indirect in the form of, well, okay, so, and again, you've been reading our work for a while, like when we say, okay, this is the path of this administration, the administration's policies are pretty clearly leading in a certain direction. Well, what are the consequences of that? Higher costs of capital, greater risks. Again, we can separately personally editorialize about how terrible it is, but that's not what people are paying us for. They are paying us for a point of view, but what does this mean for the business? And that's, if we can't draw that connection very directly, or even indirectly, then, we're probably not going to write about it.
I
Yeah,
know.
and I think we both say, follow the money is the starting point of what are the insights going to be. If we can connect it to something about reallocating budgets, that's great. That's in our lane. And while we want to be that first voice, we want to make sure that it's always really relevant to our readers and to our clients and not just overwhelming them with stuff that might not be that important to where budgets are shifting.